The crystalline walls of the Galactic Council's Hall of Justice stretched higher than any cathedral back on Earth. Captain Tyler Grant stood alone in the center of a massive circular platform, surrounded by what could only be described as a sea of alien faces. Some had multiple eyes that blinked in patterns he couldn't understand. Others didn't have faces at all, just shifting forms of light and color that somehow projected their thoughts into the translation devices everyone wore. Tyler felt small. Not just physically small, though at 6 feet tall he was barely half the height of some of the beings staring down at him from the amphitheater seats. He felt historically small, like he was standing at a crossroads where one wrong step could doom humanity's entire relationship with the galaxy. After all, he was the first human to ever stand trial before the Galactic Council, and from the looks he was getting, these aliens were ready to make an example out of him. He wore his old Earth Defense Force uniform, the dark blue fabric faded and patched in places. They'd offered him clean prisoner's clothing, something neutral and dignified. He'd refused. If he was going down, he'd go down as what he was, a soldier who'd done his duty. The uniform still had his unit patch on the shoulder, though the stitching was coming loose. 17 years of wear will do that. Around his wrists were energy restraints that hummed softly, glowing with a pale blue light. They didn't hurt, but they were a constant reminder that he wasn't here as a guest. He was the accused. The criminal. The human who'd gone too far. Above him, holographic displays the size of movie screens flickered to life, showing the charges in 17 different alien languages. Tyler could only read the English translation scrolling at the bottom: war crimes. Excessive use of force. Destruction of a protected celestial body. Violation of the Sentient Rights Accords, Section 7, Subsection 43. The list went on and on. Each charge carried a minimum sentence of 20 years in a galactic detention facility. Some carried life sentences. A few carried fates worse than death, at least according to his court-appointed defender. Speaking of which, his lawyer was currently having a nervous breakdown beside him. Vorin was his name, a tall, thin creature that resembled a cross between a praying mantis and a very anxious accountant. His species, the Valorians, were known for their logical minds and excellent legal skills. Right now, though, Vorin looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the galaxy. Captain Grant, Vorin whispered, his translator turning his clicking speech into heavily accented English. Please, you must reconsider. The prosecution has recordings. They have testimonies from 6 different species. They have satellite imagery of the Kepler incident. This is, as you humans say, open and shut. Tyler didn't respond. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw set, his posture military straight despite the exhaustion that had settled into his bones. He was 53 years old now, and he felt every single one of those years. The gray in his hair had spread like frost, and the lines on his face told stories he'd never speak out loud. If you accept the plea bargain, Vorin continued desperately, they'll reduce the sentence. Only 40 years instead of life. With good behavior, you might see Earth again before you die. Your family could visit. Your grandchildren could know you. That almost broke him. Tyler had a daughter back on Earth. Melissa. She'd been 10 years old when he'd left for his final tour of duty. Now she was 27, married, with a baby boy he'd only seen in photographs transmitted across light years of space. The thought of never holding that child, never watching him grow up, hit harder than any weapon he'd ever faced. But he couldn't take the plea. Because taking the plea meant admitting he'd done something wrong. And deep down, in a place beyond politics and law and galactic bureaucracy, Tyler knew he hadn't. He'd made impossible choices in impossible situations. He'd done things that haunted his dreams. But wrong? No. He'd saved lives. Billions of them. The massive doors at the far end of the hall began to open with a sound like thunder rolling across mountains. The crowd of alien dignitaries, reporters, and observers fell silent. Even the constant humming of translation devices seemed to quiet down. All rise, a mechanical voice announced in perfect English and 16 other languages simultaneously. The Honorable High Arbiter Thalen presiding. Tyler's attorney shot to his feet, or whatever approximation his species had of feet. Tyler stayed standing, as he'd been standing for the past hour. Around the amphitheater, hundreds of beings rose in respect for the judge who would decide his fate. Through those massive doors walked a figure that would have given Tyler nightmares if he'd seen it 17 years ago. High Arbiter Thalen stood nearly 10 feet tall, his body covered in chitinous armor that gleamed like polished obsidian. 4 arms moved with precise, deliberate grace, and his head was insectoid, with compound eyes that caught and fractured the light into 1,000 tiny reflections. He wore robes of silver that marked him as one of the 7 most powerful judges in known space, someone who'd presided over the trials of warlords and settled disputes between entire civilizations. This was the being who would judge whether humanity's first representative to galactic society was a war criminal or something else entirely. Tyler watched Thalen climb the steps to the judge's platform with the measured steps of absolute authority. Those compound eyes swept across the courtroom, taking in the crowd, the prosecution's team with their stacks of evidence, the defense table where Vorin was visibly shaking. And then those eyes landed on Tyler. The High Arbiter stopped mid-step. For 3 full seconds, the most powerful judge in the galaxy simply stared at the human in the prisoner's circle. Tyler stared back, his face carefully neutral, waiting for whatever came next. But something was wrong. Tyler could feel it. The way Thalen had frozen. The way those compound eyes seemed to widen, if such a thing was even possible. And then something else stirred in Tyler's memory, something he'd buried deep because remembering hurt too much. He knew this alien. Somehow, impossibly, he knew him. High Arbiter Thalen moved like he was walking through water, each step slower than the last as he climbed toward the judge's platform. The entire courtroom watched in confusion. This wasn't normal. Judges were supposed to be distant, impartial, almost robotic in their precision. But Thalen moved like a man who'd just seen a ghost from his past walk through the door. Tyler's heart started hammering in his chest. He told himself to stay calm, to keep his face neutral, but his hands were trembling slightly in their energy restraints. Around him, the alien dignitaries began whispering among themselves. The translators picked up fragments of conversation in a dozen languages, all asking the same question: what was happening? Thalen finally reached the judge's platform and turned to face the courtroom. His 4 arms hung at his sides, not yet assuming the formal position required for proceedings. For what felt like an eternity, he just stared at Tyler. Those compound eyes, which could see in spectrums humans couldn't even imagine, were locked onto the man in the prisoner's circle like nothing else in the universe existed. Then Thalen spoke. His voice came through the translation system, but there was something raw in it, something that technology couldn't quite capture. Grant. Tyler Grant. Lieutenant, 7th Expeditionary Division, Earth Defense Force. Serial number 732849 Alpha. Tyler felt his breath catch. Nobody here should know his serial number. That was from before, from the time Earth barely knew other life existed in the universe. That serial number belonged to a younger man, a lieutenant who'd commanded a single patrol vessel at the edge of human space, back when humanity thought they were alone among the stars. Your Honor, the chief magistrate started to say, rising from his seat with concern written across his reptilian features. Is there some issue with the proceedings? Thalen didn't answer. He kept his eyes on Tyler. Second patrol vessel, designation Defiant. Crew complement of 42. You were 29 days out from Mars Station when you intercepted an unidentified distress signal. Against direct orders to maintain radio silence during wartime patrols, you altered course to investigate. The blood drained from Tyler's face. Nobody knew about that. The mission had been classified, buried under so many layers of military secrecy that even he'd almost convinced himself it hadn't happened. But here was an alien judge, 17 years later, reciting details that should have died with him. Then something impossible happened. High Arbiter Thalen, one of the most respected judicial figures in galactic history, straightened his posture and brought all 4 of his arms across his thorax in a specific configuration. He held them there, perfectly still, in what Tyler immediately recognized as a military salute. Not a human salute, but the Vrexith version, given by soldiers to honor those who'd saved their lives. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Aliens were standing, shouting in languages Tyler couldn't understand even with the translators. His attorney Vorin looked like he might faint. The prosecution team was frantically conferring with each other, their organized stacks of evidence suddenly meaningless in the face of whatever was unfolding. But Tyler barely noticed the chaos. His eyes were locked on Thalen, and suddenly he was 29 years old again, floating in the darkness of space, alarms screaming in his ears, watching a massive alien vessel being torn apart by creatures that belonged in nightmares. He remembered making the decision that should have killed him and everyone under his command. He remembered the fear, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make a difference. Then something else started happening in the courtroom. An admiral in the observer's gallery, his body composed of what looked like liquid held together by a containment suit, rose to his feet. His species didn't have arms, but he positioned his form in their equivalent of attention. Then a general from another species stood, her 6 legs planted firmly, her crest raised in respect. a shipmaster, a fleet commander, a decorated officer with medals covering his chest. One by one, like dominoes falling in reverse, military officials from 20 different species rose to their feet. Some saluted. Some assumed positions of respect unique to their cultures. Some simply stood in silence with their heads bowed. Within a minute, 4 to 7 beings scattered throughout the massive amphitheater were standing at attention, every single one of them focused on the human in restraints at the center of the room. Tyler felt his vision blur. He blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall, but they came anyway. 17 years. 17 years of keeping quiet, of following orders, of pretending that humanity's first real contact with alien life had been the sanitized version they taught in schools. And now these beings, these warriors from species he'd bled alongside, were standing for him. Honoring him. Even as he stood trial for his life. "No," Tyler whispered, his voice cracking. "No, you can't. You'll ruin your careers. All of you. Sit down. Please." But none of them moved. And Thalen still held his salute, those compound eyes fixed on Tyler with an intensity that made his chest ache. "You survived," Tyler finally said, loud enough for the translation systems to pick up. His voice echoed through the now silent courtroom. "After everything, after the boarding, after the spores, after we barely got your people to the escape pods. You survived." Thalen's mandibles moved in what might have been a smile or might have been something else entirely. His arms finally lowered from the salute position. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion that the translators struggled to convey. "I survived because of you, Lieutenant Grant. 16,000 of my people survived because of you. Because a human ship barely more advanced than a chemical rocket saw beings in danger and chose to act." The chief magistrate was standing now, his scaled hands gripping the edges of his podium. "High Arbiter Thalen, with all due respect, if you have personal history with the accused, you must recuse yourself from this case immediately. The integrity of these proceedings depends on impartiality." Thalen turned to look at the chief magistrate, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, his voice took on the steel of absolute authority. "I will not recuse myself, magistrate. Because this council needs to understand exactly who stands in that circle. And I am perhaps the only being in this room qualified to tell them." He gestured to the holographic displays still showing Tyler's charges. "Display the date of the Kepler incident they are prosecuting. Then display the date humanity officially made first contact with galactic civilization." The dates appeared side by side on the massive screens. The Kepler incident, 17 years ago. Official first contact, 30 years ago, but that was just first detection. Formal council membership and open relations, only 17 years ago. Most of the courtroom looked confused by the discrepancy. But Tyler saw understanding dawn on the faces of the military officials still standing. They knew. They'd always known. And now everyone else was about to learn the truth that had been buried for nearly 2 decades. Thalen's 4 arms moved across the control panel embedded in his judge's platform, his movements sharp and decisive. Access codes that only a high arbiter possessed began unlocking files that had been sealed for nearly 2 decades. Red warning symbols flashed across the holographic displays, indicating classified material, but Thalen overrode every single one without hesitation. "What you're about to see," Thalen announced to the packed courtroom, "is the truth that this council decided to bury. The truth about how humanity really entered galactic society." The main holographic screen flickered and changed. Gone were the charges against Tyler. Instead, footage began playing that made several aliens in the audience recoil in horror. It was dark, grainy, clearly recorded by emergency systems during a crisis. The image showed a massive colony ship, easily 2 miles long, drifting in the black void of space. But it wasn't alone. Swarming around it like insects on a corpse were dozens of smaller vessels, organic and wrong in a way that made Tyler's stomach turn even now. "This is the passenger vessel Bright Hope," Thalen narrated, his voice steady despite the tremor Tyler could hear underneath. "My home for 6 months as we fled the consumption front. 16,000 civilians. Families. Children. The elderly. Artists, teachers, farmers. People who'd never held a weapon in their lives." The footage showed the organic ships, the devourers as Thalen called them, attaching themselves to the hull like parasites. Through the grainy video, Tyler could see sections of the colony ship's hull beginning to corrode and break apart. "Our military escort had been destroyed 3 days earlier," Thalen continued. "We were dead in space. Our engines were offline. Our weapons depleted. And the devourers were boarding us, level by level, deck by deck." He paused, and Tyler saw him grip the edge of his platform. I was a junior clerk then, 23 years old by your human counting. I'd been assigned to the lower cargo decks, helping organize supplies. I watched through the security feeds as those things came through the walls. I watched them take people. Change them. Turn them into more of themselves. The courtroom was silent except for the audio from the footage. Screams. Alarms. The sound of metal tearing. We sent out a final distress call knowing no help could possibly arrive in time. The nearest Vrexith military force was 4 days away. The nearest Council peacekeeping fleet was even further. We were going to die, and we knew it. Thalen looked directly at Tyler. And then a human ship answered. The footage switched to external cameras. A tiny vessel appeared on screen, so small compared to the colony ship that several aliens in the audience actually laughed, thinking it was some kind of mistake. The human ship looked primitive, all right angles and crude construction, with visible chemical fuel ports and what appeared to be actual metal plating instead of energy shielding. The Defiant, Thalen said. A patrol vessel from a species that had only just confirmed alien life existed. A ship that was, by galactic standards, centuries behind in technology. It shouldn't have lasted 10 seconds against the Devourers. Tyler watched the footage and remembered every single second of that day. Remembered his co-pilot, Rodriguez, shouting that they should jump to FTL and get help. Remembered his weapons officer, Patterson, calculating that they had maybe 6 missiles that might actually damage those organic ships. Remembered making the decision that went against every order, every regulation, every piece of common sense he possessed. On the screen, the tiny human ship accelerated toward the Devourers. Instead of attacking from a distance, it dove straight into the swarm. The aliens in the courtroom gasped as they watched the Defiant fire its primitive missiles at point-blank range, destroying 2 of the organic ships but taking heavy damage in return. Atmosphere vented from the human vessel's hull, visible as crystallizing moisture in the vacuum. He should have run, an admiral in the gallery said, his voice filled with awe. Any sane commander would have jumped away and called for proper military support. But Lieutenant Grant didn't run, Thalen said. He saw beings in danger and he acted. Watch what happens next. The footage showed the Defiant positioning itself directly against the spot where the Devourers had breached the colony ship's hull. Then the human vessel did something that made no tactical sense whatsoever. It extended its docking collar and physically attached itself to the breach, sealing it. He plugged the hole with his own ship, Thalen explained. And then he did something we still don't fully understand. He vented his ship's entire life support system into the breached sections of our vessel. Tyler remembered that moment. His crew thinking he'd lost his mind. The ship's AI screaming warnings about total atmospheric loss. But he'd noticed something in the initial scans, something about the devourer organisms and their biological makeup. It was a crazy theory based on half-understood alien biology and desperate hope. The footage showed the result. Everywhere the human atmosphere touched, the devourer organisms began to die. They writhed and dissolved, their organic matter breaking down into harmless residue. The aliens in the courtroom murmured in confusion. We still don't know exactly what compound in human atmosphere is toxic to devourer biology, Thalen said. Our scientists have theories. Something about your oxygen-nitrogen mix, or perhaps trace elements. But whatever it was, it worked. Lieutenant Grant killed every devourer organism in 3 entire decks just by sharing his air. On screen, the human crew was now visible through the docking collar. 42 people in bulky white pressure suits, carrying weapons that looked like they belonged in a museum. Tyler was in the lead, his younger face visible through his helmet's faceplate, gesturing to his team and moving forward into the alien colony ship. And then they came aboard, Thalen said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. 42 humans with primitive kinetic weapons and pressure suits held together with, I believe the term is, duct tape and prayers. They fought through my ship for 6 hours. 6 hours of room-to-room combat against an enemy that had defeated advanced galactic military forces. The footage became a nightmare of close-quarters battle. The humans moved in tight formations, their automatic weapons thundering in the confined spaces. Every time a devourer organism appeared, they put it down with overwhelming firepower. But the organisms fought back. Tyler watched his younger self drag a wounded crew member to safety. Watched Johnson take a hit that punched through his suit. Watched Martinez hold a choke point alone while the others evacuated civilians. 17 of them died on my ship, Thalen said. 17 humans gave their lives for aliens they'd never met, from a civilization they didn't know existed a month earlier. They cleared 8 decks. They evacuated 4,000 civilians directly to their ship's cargo holds, packed in so tight that by all rights they should have suffocated. And Lieutenant Grant stayed on the bridge of the Defiant coordinating everything while his ship fell apart around him. The footage showed the final moments. The Defiant detaching from the colony ship, its hull breached in a dozen places, listing badly, chemical fuel leaking into space. But behind it, the colony ship's emergency engines were firing. The Devourers were dead or retreating. And somehow, impossibly, the civilians were safe. 4 days later, when Vrexith military forces arrived, they found the Bright Hope limping toward friendly space with its cargo holds full of refugees, Thalen said. And they found the Defiant still escorting us, even though that ship should have been abandoned. Lieutenant Grant and his 25 surviving crew members refused to leave until they knew we'd reached safety. Thalen finally looked away from the screen and back to Tyler. This council is prosecuting you for the Battle of Vermilion Station. For destroying the moon of Kepler 442b. For what they call excessive force and unnecessary destruction. So I'll ask you directly, Lieutenant Grant, in front of everyone here, what were you doing at Kepler 442b 17 years ago? Tyler's throat was tight. He'd kept this secret for so long that speaking it aloud felt like breaking an oath. But these people needed to understand. Vermilion Station was a refugee hub, he said quietly. 12 billion people from 6 different worlds. The Devourers had seeded Kepler 442b's moon with conversion spores. In 48 hours, the whole thing would have detonated and infected every living being in the system. And what did you do? I destroyed the moon before it could detonate, Tyler said. Used every nuclear warhead in our arsenal. Turned it into dust and made sure every particle was irradiated beyond any chance of the spores surviving. Saving 12 billion lives, Thalen said, at the cost of being labeled a war criminal 17 years later. Thalen wasn't finished. His 4 arms moved across the controls again, pulling up more classified files. The prosecution team was frantically trying to object, citing protocol violations and security clearances, but the chief magistrate silenced them with a raised hand. Even he seemed to realize that something bigger than legal procedure was unfolding here. Let me tell you all a story, Thalen said, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive hall. A story about the consumption war. Most species in this room remember it, though we don't talk about it much anymore. It's uncomfortable. Embarrassing, even. For 10 years, the greatest military forces in known space were losing against an enemy that shouldn't have existed. More footage appeared on the screens. Battle after battle, fleet engagements where sleek, advanced warships were torn apart by the organic vessels of the Devourers. Planets evacuated in chaos. Space stations overrun. Entire colonies converted into breeding grounds for more of the creatures. We tried everything, Thalen continued. Energy weapons barely slowed them down. They adapted to our tactics within days. Our best strategic minds were baffled. Species that had been enemies for centuries united against this threat, and still we lost ground every month. The consumption front kept expanding, kept pushing us back, kept taking more worlds. An elderly Telharry in the gallery stood up, her feathered crest gray with age. High Arbiter, why are you bringing up this ancient history? The war ended 17 years ago. We defeated the Devourers. Did we? Thalen asked. Or did humanity defeat them for us? The courtroom erupted in protests. Aliens shouted in a dozen languages. Tyler's attorney looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. But Thalen raised all 4 arms and the room gradually quieted. After the Bright Hope incident, Earth's military command was contacted by the Council. Officially, we wanted to establish diplomatic relations. Unofficially, our military leaders wanted to know how a primitive human ship had accomplished what our best forces couldn't. How Lieutenant Grant had found a weakness in the Devourers that our scientists had missed. Thalen pulled up personnel files. Tyler saw his own face from 17 years ago, along with dozens of other humans. Engineers, biologists, tactical officers, regular soldiers who'd somehow ended up in the middle of an alien war. Humanity was offered a choice, Thalen said. Join the galactic community officially, or help us unofficially. Earth's government chose unofficially. They didn't want their people thrown into a war they barely understood. But Lieutenant Grant and about 200 other humans volunteered anyway. They were attached to various fleet actions as advisors. Technical consultants. Independent contractors. The Council's official records don't mention them at all. Tyler watched as Thalen displayed mission after mission. He recognized most of them. The defense of Tyron's Belt, where he'd suggested using the asteroid field's natural resources to create chemical weapons that disrupted Devourer biology. The evacuation of Makara, where he'd held a single corridor with one corvette for 6 hours while 2 billion refugees escaped through the orbital gates. The siege of Quellan, where human medics had figured out how to treat the Devourer infection before it fully took hold. Human tactics changed everything, Thalen said. See, we'd been fighting the Devourers like they were a conventional enemy. Advanced weapons, complex strategies, by-the-book fleet formations. But humans didn't have advanced weapons. They couldn't fight by the book because they didn't know our books. Instead, they fought dirty. A Kyryan admiral in the gallery, his tentacles trembling with emotion, spoke up without being recognized. The defense grid at Makara. That was yours, wasn't it, Grant? You told us to rig cargo haulers with emergency thrusters and ram them into the Devourer hive ships. We thought you were insane. Tyler nodded slightly. Worked though, didn't it? It saved my entire species, the Admiral said, his voice breaking. 2 billion Crini made it off-world because you were willing to sacrifice a dozen cargo ships and their crews. Because you understood that sometimes the only way to win is to do what your enemy thinks is impossible. More voices joined in from the gallery. A Quellan shipmaster stood, her crystalline body refracting the light. You trained our special forces. Taught us close-quarters combat techniques. Before you, we'd never considered boarding enemy vessels. We thought it was too dangerous, too primitive. But you showed us that sometimes you have to get in close, where their weapons can't track, where their size becomes a disadvantage. A Dorvian general, his scaled face scarred from old battles, added his voice. The biological countermeasures. You figured out that human blood plasma, when aerosolized and mixed with certain compounds, could be used as a weapon against Devourer organisms. Do you know how many worlds we saved with that knowledge? How many soldiers came home because they had a weapon that actually worked? Thalen let them speak, let the testimonies pile up one after another. Each one painted a picture of the human who'd fought in shadows, who turned impossible situations into victories, who taught the galaxy how to fight an enemy that seemed unbeatable. The turning point came at the Battle of Vermilion Station, Thalen finally said. By then, Lieutenant Grant had been promoted to commander. He was advising a joint fleet action protecting the largest refugee hub in the sector. 12 billion people from 6 different species, all crammed into orbital stations around Kepler 442. And our intelligence discovered that the Devourers had seeded the system's moon with conversion spores 3 weeks earlier. The screens showed Kepler 442b's moon, a beautiful silver orb that looked peaceful in the starlight. Thalen zoomed in, showing strange organic growth spreading across its surface like a disease. The spores were in the final stage of development. In 48 hours, they would detonate, spreading their payload across the entire system. Every living being within the blast radius would be infected, converted, turned into raw material for more Devourers. There was no cure. No way to stop it once detonation began. Tyler's hands clenched in their restraints. He remembered the moment they discovered the contamination. Remembered the panicked meetings with fleet commanders who couldn't agree on what to do. Some wanted to evacuate, but there wasn't enough time. Some wanted to try to cleanse the moon, but the spores were too deeply embedded. Everyone agreed it was hopeless. Commander Grant proposed a solution, Thalen said. Destroy the moon entirely. Use nuclear weapons to shatter it into particles small enough that the radiation would sterilize any surviving spores. Turn a moon into an asteroid field and save 12 billion lives. It was madness, a voice called out from the prosecution's table. Destruction of a celestial body is forbidden under galactic law. It destabilizes entire systems, creates navigation hazards, violates the Natural Preservation Act. It was necessary, Thalen shot back. The fleet commanders agreed. They authorized the strike. Commander Grant personally led the bombing run because he wouldn't ask anyone to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. And when those nuclear warheads detonated, when that moon broke apart in a flash of light that could be seen from neighboring systems, 12 billion people lived to see another day. Thalen pulled up the after-action reports. Tyler saw the clinical language describing what he'd done. Target eliminated. Mission successful. Acceptable losses. What the reports didn't mention was how he'd watched that moon die and wondered if he'd just committed an unforgivable sin. 2 weeks after Vermilion Station, the consumption war ended, Thalen said quietly. The Devourers retreated beyond the galactic rim. We'd broken their momentum, learned to fight them, adapted to their tactics. And the reason we could do that, the reason any of us survived, was because humanity taught us how. He looked around the courtroom, his compound eyes reflecting the faces of hundreds of aliens. So the council made a decision. We would welcome humanity officially. Give them membership, trade rights, protection under galactic law. But we would never speak publicly about the war. Never mention the humans who'd fought and died in it. Never acknowledge that the primitive species from Earth had saved us. Why? Tyler asked, his voice rough. Why hide it? Because we were ashamed, Thalen said simply. Ashamed that it took a species barely out of their own solar system to show us how to survive. Ashamed that all our technology, all our advanced thinking, all our superior civilization meant nothing against an enemy that refused to follow our rules of warfare. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Tyler could see aliens looking at each other, some with confusion, others with dawning understanding, a few with what looked like shame written across their features. The prosecution team had stopped trying to object. They sat at their table, surrounded by their carefully prepared evidence, looking like people who'd just realized they'd built their case on quicksand. Tyler's attorney, Vorin, was no longer trembling. The nervous energy had been replaced by something else. He stood straighter, his mandibles clicking in what Tyler had learned was the Valian expression of righteous anger. Your Honor, Vorin said, his voice carrying clearly for the first time since the trial began. If what you're saying is true, then these charges are not just wrong. They are betrayal of everything my client sacrificed. They are wrong, Thalen agreed. Every single one of them. Let me show you. The High Arbiter pulled up each charge individually. The holographic displays showed the accusations in glowing text, and one by one, Thalen tore them apart. Excessive force at Tyron's belt, he read aloud. The charge states that Commander Grant used unnecessary firepower against Devourer vessels, destroying them completely when disabling them would have sufficed. Thalen's mandibles clicked in what might have been a laugh. You cannot disable a Devourer hive ship. They're organic. They repair themselves. They adapt. The only way to stop them is complete destruction. Commander Grant knew this. The fleet commanders who authorized his tactics knew this. But apparently, 17 years later, prosecutors who've never faced a Devourer think they know better. He dismissed that charge with a gesture and moved to the next one. Unauthorized use of biological weapons. The charge refers to the plasma aerosol tactics developed during the siege of Quellan. He turned to look directly at the lead prosecutor, a tall being with skin like burnished copper. Tell me, Prosecutor Ken, do you know what biological weapons are? The prosecutor stood reluctantly. Weapons derived from living organisms or their products, designed to harm or kill through biological processes. And human blood plasma falls under this category how, exactly? Thalen asked. Commander Grant used his own biology, something he was born with, to fight an enemy that was immune to conventional weapons. Should he have let millions die because using his own blood might technically violate weapons treaties written for completely different situations? Prosecutor Ken sat down without answering. Tyler watched the being's confidence crumble like paper in rain. Destruction of a protected celestial body, Thalen continued. This is the big one, isn't it? The destruction of Kepler 442b's moon. The act that supposedly makes Commander Grant a war criminal. He pulled up footage of the moon, showing those organic growths spreading across its surface. Protected under what circumstances, exactly? When it's a natural astronomical body? Or when it's been weaponized by an enemy force intent on genocide? A judge from the council bench spoke up, an elderly being whose species Tyler didn't recognize. The Natural Preservation Act makes no exceptions for wartime circumstances. Then the Natural Preservation Act is a fool's law, Thalen said bluntly. Several aliens gasped at his words, but he pressed on. A law that prioritizes a chunk of rock over 12 billion living beings is not justice. It's dogma masquerading as morality. Commander Grant made the right choice. The only choice. And I was there. I saw the data. I watched the projections. If that moon had detonated, we wouldn't be having this trial because there would be no one left to prosecute. Tyler felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. For 17 years, he'd carried the weight of that decision. Wondered if he'd been wrong. Questioned whether saving those lives had been worth the price. And now, finally, someone was saying what he'd needed to hear all along. You did the right thing. But Thalen wasn't finished. He moved through the remaining charges with methodical precision, dismantling each one. The unauthorized military action that had saved a space station. The protocol violations that had evacuated a civilian transport. The insubordination that had prevented a fleet commander from making a catastrophic mistake. Every crime Tyler had committed turned out to be a life saved, a disaster prevented, a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. This council stands accused today, Thalen said finally, his voice ringing through the hall. Accused of cowardice. Of rewriting history to make ourselves feel better about our failures. We took the humans who saved us and we erased them from the record. We gave ourselves credit for victories they earned. And now, when one of those humans stands before us, we have the audacity to call him a criminal for doing what we couldn't. The chief magistrate rose to his feet, his scales shifting color with emotion. High Arbiter Thalen, you're out of order. You cannot. I can and I will, Thalen interrupted. Because I'm not just a judge today. I'm a witness. I'm someone who owes his life to the humans standing in that circle. And I will not be silent while this council commits an injustice in the name of justice. He turned to face Tyler directly, those compound eyes meeting human ones across the space between them. Commander Tyler Grant, this court finds you innocent of all charges. Not just innocent, but wrongly accused. These charges should never have been filed. You should never have been brought to trial. You should have been brought here 17 years ago to be honored. The courtroom exploded. Some aliens cheered. Others shouted in protest. The prosecution team looked devastated. But Thalen raised all four arms and somehow, impossibly, the room quieted again. Furthermore, he continued, I am recommending to the full Galactic Council that Commander Grant be awarded the Star of Valor, the highest military honor this civilization can bestow. I am recommending that humanity be formally recognized for its contributions during the Consumption War. And I am recommending that we stop lying to ourselves about who we are and what we owe. Tyler felt his knees go weak. The energy restraints around his wrists powered down and fell away. He rubbed his wrists, hardly believing what was happening. Around the courtroom, those military officials who'd stood earlier remained standing, and now others joined them. Civilians. Diplomats. Even a few members of the Judicial Council itself. But Thalen did something that caught Tyler completely off guard. The High Arbiter descended from his platform, walking down the steps with slow, deliberate movements. He reached the prisoner's circle and stopped directly in front of Tyler. Then, with careful precision, he began removing his silver judicial robes. Underneath, Tyler could see that Thalen wore something else. An old military harness, the kind Vrexith soldiers used during the Consumption War. And pinned to that harness, looking tiny and out of place against the alien armor, was a small medal. Tarnished. Worn. But unmistakable. It was a purple heart. A human military decoration. Tyler's breath caught in his throat. He remembered now. Remembered the young Vrexith clerk in the cargo hold of the Bright Hope, helping wounded civilians. Remembered pulling him aside after the rescue, both of them exhausted and covered in blood that wasn't entirely their own. Remembered unpinning his own purple heart and pressing it into the alien's hands. You gave me this, Thalen said softly, his voice barely above a whisper now. 29 years ago, on my colony ship. I asked you what it meant, and you told me it was for people who got hurt doing the right thing. You said you didn't need it anymore because your wounds had healed. But you told me to keep it. To remember that healing is harder than fighting. Thalen's mandibles trembled. I've worn it every single day since then, hidden under my robes where no one could see. A reminder of the human who saved my life when he had no reason to. Who fought for people he'd never met because it was the right thing to do. The High Arbiter brought all four arms across his thorax again in that Vrexith salute. Thank you, Tyler Grant. Thank you for my life. Thank you for my children's lives, for they would never have been born if you hadn't saved their father. Thank you for teaching me what true courage looks like. Thank you for making me believe that the galaxy could be better than its worst moments. Tyler, the hardened veteran who'd faced down nightmares and made impossible choices, who'd carried the weight of billions of lives on his shoulders and never broken, finally let the tears fall. He stepped forward and embraced the alien judge who'd been a terrified young clerk all those years ago. And in that embrace, 17 years of buried history, suppressed gratitude, and denied recognition finally came to light. The trial ended not with a verdict, but with a revelation. Not with justice served, but with truth finally spoken. And as Tyler stood there, surrounded by beings from a dozen species who'd come forward to thank him, he realized something important. He'd spent 17 years thinking he'd been forgotten. That his sacrifices had meant nothing. That the galaxy had moved on without remembering the humans who'd bled for it. He'd been wrong. They remembered. They'd always remembered. They just hadn't been allowed to say so. Until now.